Good morning, Easton. Good morning, Chestertown. Let me now ring our Tibetan bowl. As I ring this bowl, relax into this common time and space, realizing that we need to be together. We yearn for connection, the familiar faces of friends, and the sound of shared voices. Good morning to our friends, members, and visitors from both Chestertown and Easton for this joint Zoom service. Our second in 2 weeks. We should be getting good at this. Our mission is to inspire, inform, and support all who seek spiritual and personal growth and a more equal and just community. I am Jan Sprinkel, worship leader today, joining our guest speaker, Bob Clegg, for our service. Bob is known to many of you, and I'd like to welcome him back to the pulpit today. Moving on to announcements. Both congregations appreciate your ongoing generosity through your pledges. Donations may be made by mail or using the donate button on either Chestertown or Easton's website. We are continuing to adjust our COVID protocols, which seems a little odd given the outbreaks right now, as our reopening task force feels is appropriate, so that speakers, that's Bob and I for today, can go without masks while at the mic. We have found that that enhances the audio, and we need all the help we can get. For our first announcement, I'm going to pass to Easton, to Jane Terraby, for an announcement that she has for all of us.
Rev Sue asked me to remind everyone that we have homework for next week's service. Homework is due January 28th. As noted in the newsletters, Sue is requesting our responses to the question, what do I want? The question is a follow-up to the service on January 2nd on becoming ourselves. Sue is hoping to hear from many of us. Details are in the newsletter, or reach out to Sue for more details. Let's fill up her inbox.
Technical issue. Okay, and now we will open the pulpit, or not the pulpit, but the mic, for other announcements that may be available. Just wave your hand and get the attention of our tech team. Okay. There being none obvious, we'll move on to the chalice lighting.
Thank you, Jan, for that warm welcome this morning, and thanks to Philip and Jim for the music and for being the man behind the curtain today. We light our chalice this morning with these words from the Tao Te Ching. When the great way is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. When compassion and understanding falter, cleverness and hypocrisy step forth. When there is no peace in the family, filial piety and devotion arise. And when the country is confused and in chaos, calls for patriotism are heard. We light this chalice as a symbol of the light within all creation. We light this chalice for truth. May the search for truth be with us always. We light this chalice for love. May the love for others be strong in our hearts. Philip will now play our opening hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory. This is in the silver hymnal, if you have it, or gray hymnal. I believe it's 151. Is that correct, Philip?
115.
Excuse me, 115, something like that. God of Grace and God of Glory.
I need to share what a treat it is to sit practically in the piano while Philip is playing. That is great. We come in a spirit of learning and memory this morning. As I said earlier, both Easton and Chestertown congregations know Bob for his previous visits to this area. He's a member of the UU congregation of Frederick, Maryland, with a Master of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary. He serves as executive director of Justice Jobs of Maryland, which helps people get and keep jobs and get good reverence and move up to better jobs. Bob and his wife, Connie, live in Newmarket, Maryland, with their admittedly spoiled rotten cat, Lily. We're glad to have you with us this morning, Bob.
Thank you, Jim. I would invite us now into a time of reflection. Our centering prayer is adapted from writings by Jane Ellen Malden and the Reverend Susan Patrick Gray, who is the current president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So often words fail us, and we do not know to whom or what to pray. We ask for legs that can walk for peace, and we ask for arms that can work for justice. We ask for voices that can say what they mean but not say it mean, and we ask for hands that can soothe a feverish brow. We ask for the stubbornness to live the values that Unitarian Universalism calls us to, for the vision to audaciously imagine a world where no one is disposable and everyone can thrive. We ask for the fortitude to not give up the struggle that brings these ideals to fruition. We ask not to be overwhelmed by the challenges before us, challenges like addressing the pandemic fairly, how to combat white supremacy, and how to defend democracy against attacks that persist in myriad forms. We ask for the strength to remain engaged and organized to defend and expand equity for everyone. Let us draw strength and joy and hope from each other and from all that we have accomplished so far. And may we be inspired to keep dreaming big, to keep moving forward, and to keep organizing for liberation, and to keep answering the call of love and justice. By our actions and voices, may our prayers be sent. Shalom, salam, om, amen.
We'll now move on to acknowledgements of the heart. This may be a test for our tech teams since we're pulling it all together from back rooms and offices. For sharing joys or concerns, you can activate the raise hand function of Zoom by touch the more button and then reaction, and that allows you to actually have your hand rise in the picture frame. The tech team will then call on individuals to speak. And as we regularly share, I will light a candle for COVID victims, families, and frontline workers, as well as those in our congregations facing illness and recovery from surgeries or accidents. For all those joys and concerns that were shared and those that continue to be held in our hearts, let's please observe a moment of silence. Blessed be. Thank you, Philip. It was wonderful. And now a quote from Doris Lessing, a well-known English author through much of the 20th century. You know, when I was a girl, the idea that the British Empire could ever end was absolutely inconceivable. And it just disappeared like all the other empires, unquote. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, All possible opposition to the US and the West had collapsed or was weak, leaving the US as an unrivaled superpower. We had no restraints. We could exert our will freely. Democracy and capitalism had triumphed over communism and Marxism and Leninism. Commentators and pundits were almost giddy with optimism as we were entering a period of peace and prosperity for the future. Martin Luther King, quoting Theodore Parker, talked of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. So what happened? Fast forward to 2022. We have faced terrorist attacks on the homeland. We have launched 2 unsuccessful wars lasting over 10 years, resulting in untold casualties. And the success of capitalism has left large groups of our population behind us while the 1% thrive. Our domestic policies have become so toxic that we are gripped with paralysis and dysfunction. The collapse of the USSR has morphed into a Russia that not only threatens Ukraine with impunity, but has already annexed large strategic areas, while the US and NATO seem to remain powerless. The quote from Doris Lessing above suddenly seems even more relevant for democracies. After January 6, 2021's attempted overthrow of election results, the same pundits who were so optimistic now talked of the end of democracy, or at least ever conducting fair elections again, and a permanent state of domestic conflict where neither party trusts the other, and open revolution is spoken of as not just possible, but likely. It is in this context that Bob Clegg looks at the Unitarian Universalist 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process with our congregations and in society at large, and its relevance to the current crisis of our governing principles. Or are we, in the words of Doris Lessing, watching our democracy disappear like all other empires? Bob.
Thank you, Jan. I'd like to thank Jan for writing, being willing to write and share his reflections on the quote from Doris Lessing. And before I give my share, I'd like for us to ask us to just pause for a moment of silent meditation. If you would like to, if you need something, would like something to think about during that meditation moment, I invite you to consider this, to consider James Luther Adams' definition of faith. James Luther Adams' definition of faith was the certainty that we have everything we need to solve all our problems together. And so specifically, think about what that means to you. What does it mean to you that we have everything we need to solve all our problems together? When I was in seminary, I kept hearing about Reinhold Niebuhr and how his pragmatic theology had influenced so many people, including Jimmy Carter, who has always been a personal favorite of mine, who's, in fact, when we started Justice Jobs of Maryland, we copied a good bit, plagiarized a good bit of Jimmy and Rosalind's mission statement for our own, because it's just so perfect. And during a summer off from school, since I had no assignments, I decided to read Niebuhr and see where some of this stuff had come from. I guess I thought I ought to do that. And I was having a hard time getting into Reinhold Niebuhr. I was reading his later works. And so my pastor, I mentioned this to him, he said, take a look at his first book, his seminal book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. And that's where my fascination with Niebuhr's thinking really took off. In Moral Man and Immoral Society, an admittedly sexist title by today's standards, but this was written in 1932, so I'm willing to give him a pass on that. He was writing in the language of his day. In this book, though, his central thesis is that individual human beings can be moral, but large groups can never be fully so. A single person, he writes, in isolation, a single person has a decent chance of behaving morally. The best a society can do is to work out compromises that benefit the greatest number and that leave others behind. For example, put two people together and sooner or later they will cross. Triads become increasingly complex. Then look what happens when you have communities like congregations that get together, or even societies. The best we can hope for on the scale of a nation or a state is the better of two evils. Once you go international, then wars become either the failure or the instruments of foreign policy under the civilizing rules of international law, of course. So at the level of society, universal unfairness is an inevitable. I was talking with my friend Nick, who plays the piano quite beautifully, might add, at my home congregation a while back. And Nick reminded me of Niebuhr's theory. He was speaking with the wistful sadness of an aging hippie. And he said, you know, I'm really starting to think the world is never going to come to its senses in my lifetime. I really wanted to see that. Yep, I think Nick is right. The world is not coming to its senses. We all want to see that, but there is no 100th monkey, and you can despair not. This is about as low, I hope, as the sermon is going to go. My mentor is a man who used to teach philosophy at American University. He's recently moved, after the death of his wife, he moved to northern New Jersey, and I go up there about every 2 months now and visit him, and we have conversations that last for the entire time that we're together. He's an incredibly smart person. I'm just barely smart enough to keep peppering him with questions that are relevant. And the other day he said, you know, when Andrea died, his wife, when his wife died, and I remember this, it was about 2 weeks before he was saying, I'm going to need a new purpose for living besides taking care of my wife. And surviving into my 90s is not it. And so he is doing other things now. He has started playing the piano again. Amazing, another third amazing piano player here. And he has this baby grand piano in his living room at the what is it called? The center where he lives, assisted care, thank you. And he's writing 2 books, and he's learning Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics because he wants to learn to think non-linearly, and that's the last non-linear language. So he's found other meanings, and his books have to do with social justice and the philosophy of social justice, and the history of his family and his wife's family in Europe. With regards to social justice. He's found something to do besides surviving, because for him, surviving is not enough. What's the alternative, though, to simply surviving? Can you and I possibly find meaning in a world that seems to be going to hell in a bucket? Can people find individual meaning in a world that can only at best be partially fixed? It's a work in progress. And can people find collective meaning? Contrary to Niebuhr's thesis, can a limited group, something short of society perhaps, but a limited group, can they find meaning for themselves as a whole? The good news is I believe that we can at least find individual meaning, and we can find associations with other people that can give us some degree of collective meaning. Dr. Martin Luther King agreed with that. He said, you know, as a leader of both individuals and large groups, he said, if a person has not discovered something they are willing to die for, they aren't fit to live. And that's strong stuff, not fit to live if they haven't discovered something they're willing to die for. That was King's words. It sounds discordant with our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but inherent is born in. We can lose that. And King, by the way, wasn't constrained by our UU first principle, because he said that before it was codified as a principle, and also because he went with the Baptists instead of the Unitarians, so he would have somebody to preach to and lead. King seems to be saying, though, if a person hasn't discovered something they're willing to die for, then what do they really have to live for? What real meaning making is possible? Meaning making being the work of theology, of personal and group theology. What meaning making is possible for me unless I believe in something that I'm willing to pay the ultimate price for through my actions, deeds, not creeds? Until about 5 years ago, I really had little that I was cognitively prepared to die for. I'd like to think I would have taken a bullet for my wife, and I think I would have done that, especially if I hadn't had time to think about the ramifications. But there was really nothing in the way of a principle that I recognized that I was willing to die for in advance. Then in the last few years, what liberals had been denying for 50 years became undeniable, that the country and the world have been tending towards self-centered nationalism for decades. And now with far-right paramilitary groups recruiting disaffected white men from the US military who take alternative oaths that supersede their oaths to the Constitution, and who act on those oaths by threatening the lives of public officials and invade the US Capitol, this country and many around the world seem to be leaning more and more towards authoritarianism and nationalism. In this country, we may be now somewhere around where Germany was around 1925 or 1926. Are we going to continue to go in the same direction? Will we correct course and return to a placid, know-nothing liberal status quo? Or could we perhaps reverse direction and right some of the more systemic wrongs that have remained unrighted from the past 40 to 400 years? We shall see. But the last 5 or 6 years have taught me that there is something that I'm willing to die for. It's a religious principle. It's in our 5th UU principle, and it's called democracy. It's a religious principle, democracy, right there in the middle of our 5th UU principle. It's one that, a principle that Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams, who we heard from a few minutes ago, identified as his cross, the principle that he became willing to die for after his 2nd and 3rd trips to Germany in 1936 and 37, when he was working with Bonhoeffer in his underground seminary. Not only do I believe that we can find individual and collective meaning, my experience says that we can. My work in the tiny voluntary association called Justice Jobs has created meaning in my life that I've never known before. We are just one small cog on the corner of a democratic society that has a cough and is running a moderate fever, but it's a society that still has voluntary associations and the First Amendment right of assembly as its heart and its soul. I can't tell you what issues you need to work on, what voluntary associations, that's a James Luther Adams theological word, what voluntary associations you might commit to. I can't tell you what cross to select as your focus. Each of us needs to decide for ourselves whether democracy, it may be democracy, anti-racism, or saving our planet or erasing poverty and creating economic equality. Each of us has to determine what things we are willing to die for and have time to work on in 24-hour days, where some sleep is required. And nobody knows whether they would follow through on that willingness if they were called upon to do so. I'd like to think that I would. Whether we choose to do so, whether we would choose to do so or not, really is irrelevant at this point, because as Unitarian Universalists, we may be all guilty by association already. The fact is, we all take a stand by the very act of signing the UU membership book. Unitarianism has been hunted down as a radical fringe movement by fascist governments as recently as the 1940s. And if someone has an example of sense, please let me, of any examples for sense, let me know, please. In the 1970s, the US government nearly bankrupted our UUA with lawsuits over Beacon Press's printing of the unedited version of the Pentagon Papers. Those lawsuits sought the names and identifying information of every individual contributor to the UUA for a period of 5 years. So maybe there's my later example. And that intimidation, though, it extended to the local levels. Dottie Ewing was the last charter member of my home congregation. And shortly after I joined that congregation and made it known that I was attending seminary to become a UU minister, Dottie pulled me aside in the foyer one day. She was over 90 years old at that time, and she's died since. She told me in that corner of the atrium, how she and her kids were followed to their car on Sunday mornings by men with shiny black shoes and black ties who took pictures of their license plates as they drove away from the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Frederick in the early 1970s. She said that was scary for all of them, her husband, for herself, for her kids, because they knew what was going on. These things happen. Imagine government agents waiting outside the door of this building the next time you meet in person in this building. It has happened before, and it can happen again with different results. So wittingly or unwittingly, all of us have placed ourselves on the side of love. We are there. There's enough on the World Wide Web already to convict me in a court of law, and probably you. Many of you as social activists would be more easily convicted of crimes than I would against an unjust state. For many of you, the question is not, can we rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns to take on the broader concerns of all humanity? The question is whether we can see the value, the meaning in doing so. This is where Dr. Martin Luther King cuts to the heart of the matter when he said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. By saying that our lives begin to end, it seems to me that means that our lives lose their meaning when we remain silent about things that matter. Who among you wants to live a life that's already begun to end? Who among you wants to live a life of mere survival? What kind of a life is that? It sounds like Thoreau's Lives of Quiet Desperation to me. And a life of quiet desperation is one that is totally materialistic. It lacks the importance of relationship and spirituality, where I can keep my middle-class head low, stay one step ahead of economic calamity, and grit my teeth until the Grim Reaper catches up with me anyway. So what is your cross? What is your cross? What are you willing to die for? Karl Jaspers told James Luther Adams back in his first visit to Germany in 1926, he said, liberal theology is thin because it has no Zwang. I love that German word, Zwang, Z-W-A-N-G, no cost of lasting commitment. I like to translate it, it doesn't mean this, but no zip. No cost of lasting commitment is what the word means. And the Unitarians of Eastern Europe during World War II proved Jaspers wrong. Their liberal theology had Zwang. They sheltered gypsies, they sheltered Jews, and they did it often at the cost of being hung or gassed. These Unitarians might not have had a Trinitarian God, but their religion sure had Zwang, the cost of commitment to a bitter end. So the converse of MLK's statement is also true. If our lives begin to end when we become silent, then our lives begin the day we stand up for things that matter. When we take a stand is when our lives really begin to grow in meaning. And at first, when I joined Unitarian Universalism about 7 years ago, has it been that long? Wow. I thought you folks had been waiting here for me for 40 years. But soon I realized you weren't waiting around for me at all. You've been busy the whole time. Maybe you hadn't saved the world yet, but at least you were on the path. And what had UUs been doing? Publishing the Pentagon Papers, opening your pulpits to women and LGBTQs, making mistakes and trying again on matters of racial justice and equality and equity, leading on climate change, UUing the vote. And you had been able to do these things, not because you looked at them and just started doing them, but because you prepared yourselves in the very special voluntary associations that James Luther Adams called our UU churches. You had been doing these things, preparing yourselves to be ready to act when we go out into the community. You studied together, you worked together, you planned together, you trained together before doing these amazing things and the things that our congregations and association continue to do. You did the inside job first, the inside work, and then you go out into the world to do the outside job. You did your personal theology first, and on that inner strength, you moved into the outside theology of the public square so that you could react with strength and fortitude and on principle when you were called upon, when somebody pushed it. If there's one thing you take from this service, I hope it's this, that our task during this pandemic, when it's so appropriate to stay inside and study and learn on the internet, whatever we do, learn with each others in groups on Zoom. Our task during this pandemic is to develop the inside job of private theology, to revisit that in preparation for the outside job of public theology that will come in due course. The inside job piece, it's our first principle. It's inherent worth and dignity of each and every person. It's the acceptance and the third principle is the thing about spiritual growth, the challenge for us to work for personal spiritual growth and to help each other, assist each other in that endeavor. To want to really develop in a very intentional way the inner life that has to do with the life we live out in the world. And then when the time comes, when the surge passes, when the elections are near, whenever, whatever it is that you need to be involved in, execute then that outside job by carrying the message of public theology, of your personal, what makes meaning for you and what makes meaning in Unitarian Universalist terms. That's the seventh principle piece, the tension that's opposite the first principle, the inside job. The seventh principle is that interconnected web of existence of which we're all a part. That's the public theology, which extends, the web extends beyond the connections between Unitarian Universalists in congregations and really challenges us to attempt to spread beloved community beyond these walls and into the world, carrying beloved community out into the world. Now, by working on these dual tasks, hand in glove, the inside job and the outside job, or alternately as it may be, may you embody Dr. King's ideals of being leaders who live above the fog in public duty and in private thinking. May you resolve that tension between principle 1 and principle 7 by practicing both seamlessly. And may you resolve then that human condition in our own lives and minister to others who would be the same, who would realize the same. May it be so. Our closing words are from Nelson Mandela. I've walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter, and I've made missteps along the way. But I've discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance that I've come. But I can rest for only a moment, for with freedom come responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.
We've come to the end of this time of celebration and challenge, and we entrust our spirits back into this world, and may such strength as we have gained in this communal hour sustain us as we resume the work that is at hand. We are better people for having spent this time together. Go in peace.
For those who would like more discussion, please stay online and continue with our virtual coffee hour. Thank you very much.